Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are reviewing for the lab final exam. Specifically, we are looking at the ways that you can predict the actions of muscles based on their location. So for each of these rules that we're going to talk about, we are exploring the way that I can use the location of a muscle to tie that together with what it's going to do in the body. The first time that we started using muscle locations to help us predict actions, we were talking about the muscles of the leg. Now, here's a quick note for us to remind us in anatomy terms. In anatomy, technically this part right here is the leg, and technically this part right here is the thigh. So as a heads up, when you see terminology, we are talking about the thigh up here, and we're talking about the leg down lower. I know we all can answer this question. What's the name of the bone that's found in the thigh? What bone lives in the thigh? Well, one of us can answer that question. The big bone that lives here in the thigh, that bone is called the femur. The femur makes up the thigh. Down below it, we have the big T-shaped bone called the tibia. And on the outside, on the lateral side, we have the smaller one called the fibula. So the tibia and the fibula, part of the leg, the femur part of the thigh. So our first set of rules for us to memorize is that muscles that live on the front part of the thigh or muscles that live on the medial part of the thigh, they're going to help us to flex the femur. Muscles that live on the back part of the thigh help us to extend the femur. Now, before we go through and explain how these things work, we need to remind ourselves about what these words mean. I've got the word flex and I've got the word extend. In the chat, help me out. What does this word flex mean? What does flex mean? Get myself a little arrow here. Yeah, so our technical description of what flexing means is that we're making the angle smaller between two parts of the body. In extension, we make the angle bigger between two things. When you're thinking about the femur and we're talking about flexing and extending it, I'm going to add some arrows here to our skeleton. When we talk about flexion of the femur, what we're doing is we're pulling the femur forward. Flexion of the femur is when the femur moves forward. Extension of the femur is when the femur moves backwards, when the femur goes the other direction. Extension of the femur. So when we talk about the places where muscles live, dictating their actions, when you're memorizing rules, if you don't want to memorize the word extend in your rule, maybe just remember that this pulls it backwards when we're talking about the femur, or we're pulling it forwards when we're flexing the femur. When we think about muscles in the body, the way that muscles make things move comes down to that activity that we did at the end of almost every single lab packet in this unit. It comes down to those things that we talked about called origins and insertions. Origins and insertions. When I talk about the origin of a muscle, that's a place that does or does not move. Do origins move? Yeah, origins do not move. So the origin of a muscle, attachment site without movement. Here we go. My origin is my attachment site where there's no movement. My insertion then is the place where there is movement. There is movement. And when we talk about the kind of movement that the insertion does, the insertion is always going toward the origin. So when we're looking at muscles, the goal of a muscle contraction is always to take the insertion toward the origin. Here's an idea that we haven't explicitly said, but I think it will help you to understand. So this would be a note that might be good for you to write down. Let me type it and then I'll say it. The note that I want us to write down, when we look at muscles on limbs, so when we look at something on the arm or the leg, the distal attachment site is going to be the insertion. The distal attachment site, the one that's farther away, is going to be the insertion. That's going to be the part that moves. So let me help you visualize this by drawing some pretend muscles here on our skeletons to show off these rules. One of the muscles that lives on the anterior side of the thigh is that muscle you labeled called rectus femoris. Rectus femoris is found right here, parallel to the femur. Remember, that's what rectus means. So rectus femoris is going to attach up here in the hip, and it's going to attach down here kind of toward the bottom of the femur. On rectus femoris, so let me draw my little muscle here. Here's my pretend rectus femoris, lives right here. We have an origin that's up here by the hip, and we have an insertion that's down here lower. I told you that the insertion is always distal. Here's my proximal part at the hip, here's my distal part down here. Now, I'm looking at this head on from rectus femoris. So if I was staring at you straight in the face, this is where rectus femoris would look like. Check it out though if I put it sideways on my leg over here. So let me add for you. Here's rectus femoris. I'm going to get rid of my arrows. Here's rectus femoris. And I have at the top up here in the hip, my origin. And I have at the bottom down here, my insertion. When I contract this muscle, the insertion moves toward the origin. The way that that's going to make movement happen is this insertion point is going to pull forward. Because see how the origin is up here on the top and the front? My insertion is going to move toward it. My insertion is going to do flexion. It's going to go this direction. It's moving toward the origin, not directly. It's not going. We're not going to kill yourself by pulling it up, but it's going to pull it forward. This is the muscle that lives on the anterior side of the thigh, so it's flexing it. It's pulling it toward the front. Yeah, if you're Jacqueline, if you're talking about kind of like pulling your thighs in to hug yourself kind of thing, sure, yes. So flexion is when I pull my femur closer to my body, tucking my femur closer to my body. We said, yeah, so when you're in the seated position and you kind of pull your femur up, absolutely, that'd be flexion of the femur. If you're a muscle that lives on the front side, you're going to pull that insertion up toward the origin. We're going to pull it up. If I live on the back side, I'm going to pull it backwards. I'm going to extend it. So let's draw a little muscle. We're going to draw our muscle back here called biceps femoris. Biceps femoris here on the back side. In biceps femoris, my origin is up here at the top. My insertion is down here on the bottom. I'm on the back side of my skeleton. So if I go over here to the side view to help me figure out exactly where things are going to move, here is the muscle I just drew. Here's biceps femoris. At the top, I have my origin. At the bottom, I have my insertion. When I move this insertion toward this origin, I'm going to pull it backwards. because my attachment site is here in the back. I'm moving toward the back side. So when I contract this muscle that lives on the back side of the thigh, this muscle is going to pull the thigh backwards. This muscle is going to do the process of extension. So if you are a muscle that lives here on the back side of the thigh, you're always going to pull that thigh back toward the back side of the body where you're attached. If you live on the front side of the thigh, you're always going to pull the thigh forward toward the front side where you're attached. When we talk about the medial side in terms of flexion or extension, there's really just two muscles that fit into this rule. And I'm going to be honest with you, it may just be easiest to memorize these ones. The two muscles that are found on the medial side that do flexion are the adductor group and Sartorius. Sartorius is really hard to visualize. It's that one that kind of crisscrosses a little bit. So I'd say memorize this one. Oh yeah, Jacqueline's mentioned Gracilis as well. Yep, so Gracilis would be the same thing where it's right along the very middle. So we'll add that to the list. I can't remember, did we make you predict on that one too? We might have. Yes, okay. So these ones all live on the middle. It's a little bit harder to visualize them helping with the process of flexion. So I would say just remember that medial muscles help us with flexion just like those anterior muscles do. We can visualize how the anterior muscles do it. It's a little bit more weird when we start trying to think about the medial ones. So here's our first set of rules. Anterior and medial, if this is where you live, you do flexion. You pull the femur forward. Posterior muscles, if this is where you live, you pull the femur backwards. You do extension. Before I move on, what questions do we have about flexion and extension? Or are we good on this one so far? Okay, well, I'm not getting any chatter, so we'll move on. This is another view of the same thing. I'll just point out, we can do the exact same activity here. Anterior side doing flexion and posterior doing extension. So let me draw for you a muscle here. What I like about this skeleton is I can see, let's see, we'll add somebody in the back and we'll add somebody in the front. Since this skeleton isn't standing straight up, it's a little bit easier for us to see what it looks like when we do these different movements. Flexion was the process of taking the femur and pulling it forward. So when this insertion pulls forward, because its attachment site is on the front, this would do flexion because it lives on the front side. This is a muscle that I just made up on the back side of the leg. Its attachment site that moves is on the back side, moving toward the back even more. This muscle that lives on the back is going to do extension. So if I live on the back, I'm going to pull things toward the back. If I live on the front, I'm going to pull things toward the front. Flexion and extension of the femur. The other movement for us to know with the femur is abduction and adduction. Abduction and adduction. These words show us what's going on compared to the midline of the body, compared to the middle of the body. When I'm doing adduction, I'm pulling the femur back toward the middle. When I'm doing abduction, I'm pulling it away. I'm pulling it toward the outside. Actually, here, let's put both of my labels on the same leg so we can see. Okay. Abduction toward the middle, adduction toward the middle, I apologize. Abduction toward the outside. So here's a muscle that lives on the outside of the thigh. This muscle out here is Gluteus Medius, my middle-sized one. Remember that I told you guys that the distal location is always the insertion. So here's my distal location, that's the insertion. I'm going to pull this distal location up toward this proximal location. Pulling these together is going to make this whole femur go out. It's going to go toward the outside. When I take this bone marking and I pull it out, that leads me to do the process of abduction when I pull it away. Another muscle that we needed to predict our actions on was the adductor group. Here's that adductor group right there. The adductor group, here's my origin because it's proximal. Here's my insertion because it's distal. When I move this origin toward this insertion, that pulls my entire femur back toward the middle. So my femur goes back toward the middle. That's adduction. A muscle that lives in the middle part here is going to pull it that direction, going to pull it toward the middle. A muscle that lives on the outside, out here, when I start pulling that insertion toward the origin, that's going to pull the whole femur out and away. That's going to do abduction. Yeah, so Nicole asked about abduction, adduction. Is that like a jumping jack? Absolutely. So the process of moving toward the outside, what we're doing with our lateral muscles out here, that's when you spread your legs out in the jumping jack. And when we pull our legs back together in the jumping jack, that's adduction. So legs out, abduction, legs in, adduction. Yeah, let me grab my skeleton and I can pull it up. I know it's going to be small on your screen. It's been a little while since the skeleton felt the love here, so he'll appreciate a little time. Let me turn on my camera and see if we can see him. Oh, okay, 1 minute, I gotta switch cameras here. All right, switched cameras. Let me get it showing. Here's my friend the skeleton saying good morning. Can you all see him down there? Probably pretty small. Okay, so we're talking abduction, adduction. Let's go down here to the femur. Okay, when the femur is in normal position, when I pull it up like this, let me scoot back a little bit. When I pull it up like this, that's abduction. So the part where you jump out in a jumping jack. When I pull it back in, that's adduction. We're adding it back. So abduction, if you live on the outside of the pelvis, you're going to pull that femur out. If you live on the inside of the femur, attached on the inside of the pelvis, you're going to pull the femur back down. When I go from the side to what we just talked about before, his hips all out of whack here. What we talked about before is flexion. If you live on the top of the femur, you flex the femur up. If you live on the back side of the femur, you extend it back down. So flexion of the femur and extension of the femur. And then we had abduction and adduction. Did my skeleton friend help? He wants to know. Make him feel good. Yes, perfect. Okay. Well, I'll bring him back too as we continue working on stuff here. He's going to wave goodbye for now. Good boy. Can he take your exam for you? He can't take the exam for you, but I would, and I think I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. Since you're taking the exam by yourself, there's absolutely nothing that says you can't like do an interpretive dance to try to figure out what's going on here. So 100% act these movements out on yourself. Feel where muscles are, try contracting muscles, use your body to help you on the exam, because you have, yeah, Proctoria will have that recording, but no one else will, and I won't watch it. If you email me and say you did an interpretive dance, I promise I won't judge you for it. But you can totally, since no one's going to see, you can totally think your way and act your way out through these things. I 100% recommend that. I promise I won't laugh at you. If we were in class together, I would be doing all these actions for you. So I look like just as much of an idiot as you'll feel like. Okay. Here is, we're moving on to the next set of movements here. With these movements, I need you to what page are we in the packet, by the way? So I can mention that on the recording. Okay, we're on page 12, and is this lesson number 8, right? What packet are we in? Talking about the tibia movements now. Okay, so lesson 8 packet, page 12. I need you to underline for yourself to make sure that you recognize this. We are now talking about movements of the tibia. When we talk about movements of the tibia, we're actually doing the opposite movements for what we're doing. I didn't cut out, I turned it off because I coughed. I didn't say anything. When we talk about, so I'll say it again though. When we talk about movements of the tibia, if you live on the front side of the thigh, when we were talking about front side up here, this did flexion of the femur. When we talk about now movements of the tibia down a little bit lower, if you live on the front side of the thigh, you extend the tibia, meaning you pull the tibia forward. If you live on the back side of the thigh, you flex the tibia, meaning you pull the tibia backwards. So let's look at these muscles here. We'll do one that we did before. We talked about before rectus femoris. Remember that our insertion, the part that's moving, is always down at the bottom. Our origin, the non-moving part, is always up here at the top. When this insertion moves toward this origin, we are pulling the tibia farther away from the femur. When I increase the angle, that's what extension means. When I increase the angle at a joint, I am doing the process of extension, pulling the tibia forward, pulling it away from the femur where it likes to be close to. That's the process of extension. If you're a muscle that lives on the front side of the thigh, when you attach down here on the tibia, you make the tibia go forward. So extension of the tibia is when you go to kick a ball. Extension of the tibia, kicking a ball. So if you live on the front side of the thigh, you help with kicking a ball. You do extension. If you live on the back side of the thigh, you do flexion. Remember that the word flexion means that we're bringing two things closer together. So let's do a muscle from the back side here. So semi-tendinosis, for example, is here along the back side. Remember, I've got my origin up higher. I've got my insertion down lower. When I bring this insertion toward this origin, my tibia is going to go backwards. My tibia going backwards brings the tibia and the femur closer together. Since they're coming closer together, that's doing flexion. So half the battle of making these predictions is first being able to act out or feeling what it would feel like when the muscle contraction happens. Once we know what it feels like or what it would look like, then we have to put the anatomy word to it. Are we extending, which means we're making things farther apart? Or are we flexing? Are we bringing them closer together? Let's use this picture here that I pulled before because we've got the legs bent. I think that'll help it be a little bit easier for us to see. I'm a muscle that lives on the back side of the leg here. Here's my origin. Here's my insertion. When I bring this insertion closer to this origin, the femur and the tibia are going to get closer together. When they get closer together, that's the process of flexion. I lived on the back side. I pulled them together. That does flexion. Over here on the other leg, I live on the front side. I'm anterior. My origin is up high. My insertion is down low. When I bring this insertion toward this origin, I'm going to straighten out the leg. When I straighten out the leg, the femur and the tibia get farther apart from each other. Getting farther apart from each other is extension. So, when we talk about moving the tibia versus moving the femur, please make sure to remember, are we talking extension or flexion? Which way they're moving? Act it out and think about how we described it. Whether we're talking about making the angle bigger or smaller, whether we're bringing it forward or backwards, we can't really use that when we're talking about moving of the tibia because it's mixed up. So angle gets bigger, angle gets smaller, flexion and extension. Yeah, so Jacqueline said the challenge she has is when it asks about both at the same time. I'm going to be totally honest with you. It is on purpose that we're asking you about both at the same time because the goal is to get you to realize they do opposite things. So when I'm a muscle that lives on the front side of the femur, what I do to the femur is I make the femur come forward. When the femur goes forward, that's flexion. I also make the tibia go forward, but when the tibia goes forward, that's extension. It's because of the shape of the joints that we're moving things at. So 100%, Jacqueline, I feel your comment that it confuses you. It's confusing on purpose because we want you to be thinking about how they actually are opposites. The words that we use to describe it are opposite. The way that the femur moves, when the femur goes forward, that's called flexion. When the tibia goes forward, that's called extension. When the femur goes backwards, that's extension. When the tibia goes backwards, that's flexion, because it's all about the distance between our bones. So let me show you. When the femur goes forward, the angle between the pelvis and the femur gets smaller. When the angle gets smaller, that's flexion. When the tibia moves backwards, the angle between the tibia and the femur gets smaller. That's flexion. When the tibia, or excuse me, when the femur is moving backwards, the distance or the angle between the pelvis and the femur gets larger when the femur moves backwards. That's extension. When the tibia moves forward, so we'll do our movement here. When the tibia moves forward, the space between the femur and the tibia gets bigger. That's why we call it extension. Extension. What thoughts or questions do we have? Help me help you. Yeah, Hannah says she's processing. It's going to take processing. Yes, and it's definitely going to take practice. What I'll say too is I'm trying to show you why the rules work. When I was a student, it was so hard for me to memorize without knowing why. So I'm trying to show you why. But here's the thing. If you feel like why doesn't help you, it's 100% okay for you to just memorize. If you just want to memorize that if you're on the anterior thigh, you extend the tibia, there's nothing wrong with that. If you can just straight memorize that rule, go for it. You don't have to understand it. If you want to understand it, I'm trying to help you understand. But if you want to just memorize that rule, knock yourself out. That's totally okay. So just for the record, I'll say that. I want to help you understand, but if you feel like it's confusing you, you don't have to understand it to be able to memorize it. So do what works for you. Let's see. So Nicole's asking about the movements of a squat or when you're sitting. So those kind of, I'm trying to visualize it too, because there's a lot that's going on in that. Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're saying that everything seems to get smaller. That's correct. If we were sitting down, so let me clear off my whiteboard here. When we sit down, we go from having our legs straight up and down to being closer to us. So the process of sitting, we would be flexing the femur. The femur's coming closer to the hip. When we talk about what's going on with the tibia, so I'm picturing here we're straight. The tibia basically ends up flexing as well, right? Because when this goes to a straight line, we'll do a terrible little drawing here. Here's my femur now, my little foot, add some toes. When you're sitting, there's patella. When you're sitting, the femur is straight out. The tibia and the fibula are hanging down like this, and there's the foot. So we went from having an angle that was this big, so an angle that was from the front of the hip that was this big to an angle that's smaller. We've flexed the femur. And the position, when we say what's flexion or extension of the tibia, it's a reference between the femur and the tibia. So the space between the femur and the tibia also got smaller. So we also flexed the tibia as well. So sitting down, we would say would be flexion. We're bringing the femur closer to the hips. We're bringing the tibia closer to the femur. Then when you stand back up, we extend the femur and we extend the tibia to make them farther apart from each other. Yeah, so Erica asked about the movement, a high kick, when we're kicking up high. Yes, so lifting your thigh up into the air, that would be flexion of the thigh, pulling it up high. When we talk about I'm saying it, extending the foot, so kicking essentially, the kick motion at the end would be an extension motion because we'd be making the distance between the femur and the tibia bigger. So if the distance between the femur and the tibia gets bigger, like when you kick a ball, That's extension. The distance between them got bigger. When I pull my thigh forward, when I bring it closer to my pelvis, that's flexion. So kicking a ball is a good example of flexion of the femur. The femur gets closer to the hip, and extension of the tibia, because the tibia gets farther away from the femur. And that, in a nutshell here, let me type that. Kicking a ball that is flexing the femur, that is extending the tibia. This is why we ask you the questions on the homework about what muscles do to both of these bones. Because notice when we're talking about doing a body movement, we're doing the opposite words. We're using the opposite words to describe what happened to the femur and to the tibia. So if that helps you to remember that there's opposites, that's where I'm going big picture with all of this stuff, is the action I do on the femur is the opposite of the action I do on the tibia. All my friends who live on the front side of the thigh make the tibia extend, but they make the femur flex. All my friends who live on the back side of the thigh flex the tibia, but they extend the femur. Yes, so Nicole kind of summarized what I was trying to say. Basically, we just need to know that the action words they do are opposite. So we need to know what the femur is doing. If we know the action word for the femur, we know it's the opposite action word for the tibia. Absolutely. Biggest picture, just know we're doing opposites. Let's look at a couple of quick movements here. The tibio-tarsal joint. Can you tell me in the chat, where's the tibio-tarsal joint? Tibio-tarsal. Yeah, tibio-tarsal is the fancy name for the joint between our tibia and our tarsal bones back here. So the tibio-tarsal joint is your ankle joint. Remember that all of these bones down here are called tarsals. That's the one where we had the talus, the calcaneus, the tiger cubs need milk. That's these guys down here. When we talk about movements of the foot at the ankle joint, essentially, there are two movements we can do. We can do, oops, I forgot to fix my words here. I put dorsiflex twice. What's the opposite of dorsiflexion? Does anyone know the word that's the opposite of dorsiflexion? Yeah, plantar flexion. Plantar flexion. There's Dr. Ellis's copy and paste error of the morning. Okay. If I live on the front side of the leg, I'm going to dorsiflex the foot. If I live on the back side of the leg, I'm going to plantar flex the foot. Let's look at what these movements would look like here. Dorsiflexion, this beginning part dorsi in its name refers to dorsal. So I'm taking the top of my foot and I'm moving it toward the back side of the body. Dorsiflexion. That's what you do when you rock back on your heels. Dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion is the movement that I do when I'm standing on my tiptoes. Remember that plantar was the bottom part of the foot. Plantar flexion is when you extend your toes down or you push your toes down to stand on top of them. Plantar flexion. When we're talking about muscles living on different parts of the leg down here, helping us to do these movements, I have my muscle right here Here's Tibialis Anterior. Remember, the origin is up top and the insertion is down below. When I move this attachment site toward the front side of my leg, I end up rocking back on my heel. I end up doing dorsiflexion. If you live on the front side of the leg, you pull the top of the foot toward the back side of the body, toward the tibia. That's called dorsiflexion. If I live on the back side of the leg, like a muscle called Gastrocnemius, that's our big one on the back side of the leg, my origin is up top, my insertion is down below. When I move this insertion toward this origin, I'm pulling the whole foot backwards. When I pull it backwards, that pushes it down. That's called plantar flexion. So if you live on the front side, you pull the top of the foot and the whole foot toward the back of the body. You're rocking back on your heels. If you live on the back side, you pull the whole foot toward the ground. You do what's called plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, the last rule for us to know, front side versus back side. How do we feel about the legs? Yeah, so Jacqueline, for the sake of predictions, we would say that fibularis is on the back side. Yes. We thumbs up on the legs. How do we feel about the legs? Got a couple of thumbs up. We'll try to circle back to it at the end too. Let's talk arms. There are two major areas, actually three, I guess, major areas that we need to know movements around. We need to know movements around the shoulder. That's the glenohumeral joint. We need to know movements around the elbow. That's things like the humero-ulnar joint and the humeroradial joint. And then we need to know movements around the wrist joint. So we're going to start here at the elbow joint. When we talk about the elbow joint, all we need to know here is flexion and extension. Remind me in the chat, when I say flexion, what did flexion mean again? What does that word flexion mean? Yeah, flexion, we're bringing things together. The angle or the distance between them is getting smaller. So when we talk about muscles that live on the front side of the arm, like for example, biceps femoris, my origin is up top. And remember, my insertion is down below because it's distal. When I bring this insertion toward this origin, my entire muscle, or my entire forearm here, is going to pull this direction. Let me draw my arrow. My forearm is going to move closer to my arm because here's that insertion, here's that origin. I pull them together. If you live on the front side of the arm, like biceps brachii, you do the process of flexion. You bring things together. If you live on the back side of the arm, like triceps brachii back there, drawing my origin and the insertion here. When I bring this insertion toward this origin, I'm pulling these bones farther apart. So they were bent together and I'm pulling it backwards. This is the process of extension. This one's going to pull those bones apart. I think it will be easier for us to see extension when I go back to that other one though. Let me show you here. Oops, did I include it? Uh-oh. Okay. We're going to go back to, let me go back to this guy right here. This one, we're going to use our rules for flexion and extension on this one, because I think it'll be a little easier for us to see. If you live on the back side, notice how right now I have this much space between these muscles. Here's my angle right here. When I take this muscle and I contract it, so I make this little green part here, move closer to this part here, what ends up happening is the angle between them went from being this big to being this big. That's the process of extension. So if we're talking about gym movements here, flexion is your bicep curl. If you live on the front, you do a bicep curl, you pull it together. Extension is when they go, the arm bones go back down, when I make the humerus and the radius of the ulna as far apart as possible. If you live on the back side of the arm, you pull them apart. If you live on the front side of the arm, you bring them together. Flexion on the front, extension on the back. Let's see. Oh, now we're onto the wrist joint. Okay. So we talked about, yeah, I apologize. That's my husband. My husband is doing dishes and whistling. So fun fact, I found this company online that sells like 20-pound soundproofing sheets, and we have our order in for one right now to try to cover the door to make it a little bit less loud. So yeah, we got some whistling going on. We might hear some crying babies soon. That is the work from home life. I'm sure we all can relate. Okay, we just taught flexion of the elbow joint. Now we're going to talk about flexion and extension of the wrist joint. The good news is, unlike what was going on here with the knee, where it was flip-flopped, it's the same when we're talking about the elbow and the wrist. So the muscles that lived on the front side of the arm flexed the radius and the ulna. It brought them closer to the humerus. The muscles that live on the front side of the forearm and go down into the hand down here, these are going to flex the hand as well. So when your hand goes from being straight forward out to when you bring it closer to your forearm, that's the process of flexion, bringing them together. The muscles that help you do flexion live on the front side of your forearm. The muscles that help you do extension, that pull your hand back, those are the ones that live on the posterior side. Now here's the best news ever about front side versus back side muscles in the arm. Their name is typically going to say their movements. So when we talk about our big muscles that live on the back side of the arm, these are muscles like Extensor Digitorum or Extensor Carpi Radialis. We said that the ones that live on the back do extension. Well, their name tells us that they do extension too. So if you live on the back side of the arm, you're an extensor. You'd pull the hand backwards, farther away from the radius and the ulna. If you live on the front side, you're going to pull the hand forward. You're going to do flexion. So I'm visualizing it to make sure I tell you correctly. Yeah, so the process that we'd go through to hold that tray flat, because we were talking about at the beginning of class, right, how the pisiform bone is what you feel. When you extend your wrist all the way back, you can feel your pisiform bone sticking out. Yes. So we extend the hand backwards to hold that tray. When we put our hand back toward normal position, or when we bring it down closer to the forearm, that is flexion. So flexion forward, extension backwards when we're talking about the wrist. Also the same when we're talking about the radius and the ulna compared to the humerus. Flexion forward, extension backwards. But remember, here's my wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Remember, when the tibia moves forward, so when I pull it this way, when the tibia goes forward, that's extension. When the tibia goes backwards, that's flexion, because that's bringing closer together the femur and the tibia. Flexion versus extension. It's the same everywhere except the tibia. The tibia's got to be the odd man out, make everything weird for us. One other movement at the wrist joint, lateral versus medial muscles. We're back to those words we talked about before. Abducting versus adducting. Remind me in the chat, when we talk about moving the hand toward the middle of the body, so imagine the pinky here sliding toward the middle of the body, was that abduction or adduction when this pinky comes toward the middle? Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in correctly. When I move something toward the midline of the body, that's adduction, or adding it back. When I move it away from the middle of the body, that's abduction. I'm moving it away. So when we talk about abduction and adduction at the wrist joint, again, this should be another one that hopefully we can visualize and make sense of. If we attach over here on the lateral side of the hand, let me add my color coding again. My insertion is going to move toward my origin. My insertion moves toward my origin. When I do this movement, the entire hand gets pulled toward the outside. It gets pulled away from the middle of the body. That's abduction, pulling it away from the middle of the body. When I talk about a muscle that lives on the inside, the medial side of the arm, that I'm gonna take this insertion, move it toward the origin. That's gonna pull the whole hand toward the middle. Now we're doing adduction, where we add the hand back together. Your muscles that you're making a prediction for abduction and adduction on are, let me get my packet here. It's ulnaris and radialis. I believe it's the flexors, right? Flexor carpi ulnaris. Yep. Flexor carpi ulnaris and flexor carpi radialis. I'll type their names. Super long. Don't want to type in green. Okay. Flexor carpi radialis. Flexor carpi ulnaris. When we think about radialis versus ulnaris, which of these two muscles would be found on the lateral side? Flexor carpi radialis or flexor carpi ulnaris? Who's on the lateral side? I probably should have numbered them, right, to make it easier to type. Here's a 1, here's 2. It comes down to which bone is on the lateral side, right? So the lateral side is the thumb side. This bone that I have out here is the radius. Flexor carpi radialis, the one that's more on the radius side, that's the one that's lateral. So that one's going to do abduction, where it pulls the whole hand up and toward the outside. Flexor carpi ulnaris is on the ulna side. The ulna is medial. When I take my hand and I move it toward the medial side, that's adduction, when I'm adding it back together. Lateral and medial. Hey, by the way, this is the same lateral and medial that we had going on down here. Let me draw some muscles down here. Remember, if you lived on the medial side of the femur, you did adduction. You pulled the femur back in. If you lived on the lateral side of the femur, you did abduction. So it's the same at the wrist joint as it is at the coxal joint. If you're on the outside, you're always going to pull things more toward the outside. That's called abduction. If you're on the inside, you're always going to pull things more toward the middle. That's called adduction. So here's a joint where they're doing the same thing, abduction, adduction. We also do, I'll come back to the flexion extension. We also do abduction and adduction. Oh, I didn't change it again. Oh, Dr. Hollis. We do it as well with the entire arm. Let me change it down here. Okay. Abduction and adduction of the entire arm. When we were first learning these movements, this is what I showed for you. If the aliens abduct me and both of my arms swing up, that was technically abduction of the humerus or abduction of the arm at what's called the glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint, essentially. When we talk about who does abduction versus who does adduction, it's actually the same rules as we've seen other places. My major muscle that does abduction of the arm, what's the muscle that lives on top of your shoulder? What's the big triangle shaped muscle up top here? Yeah, the deltoid is your major abductor muscle. So it lives on the lateral side, it lives on the outside, or it attaches to the outside of the humerus. When it contracts, let's draw our insertion and our origin. When it contracts, it pulls the entire humerus and the whole arm with it up. So it's pulling it away from the midline of the body. When that muscle contracts to bring this insertion toward this origin, we're doing the process of abduction. All of the other muscles that you're predicting on in terms of abduction or adduction are attaching to the medial side of the humerus. So for example, one of them that you're predicting on is pectoralis. Here's kind of generally where pectoralis would be. It attaches, oops, let's get my colors again. Got our insertion and our origin. When I contract this muscle, I take the humerus and I pull it toward the middle of the body. So bringing your arm back down or bringing it back closer to the midline of the body, that's adduction. If you live on the front side, things like pectoralis that lives on the front side, that's going to adduct the arm, pull the arm back toward the middle of the body. If you're things like Latissimus Dorsi, let's draw Latissimus Dorsi back here. That's the big one in the back. Here's Latissimus Dorsi. Latissimus Dorsi, here is my insertion. Here is my origin. When I pull on the humerus, I'm going to pull the humerus toward the midline of the body. I'm going to do adduction, pulling it to the middle of the body. So if you live, here's kind of big picture rule that always applies. If you live on the lateral side of the body, 100% of the time, you're going to abduct. If you live more on the medial side of the body, you're going to adduct. Or in the case of when we're thinking about these muscles right here that we called anterior and posterior, If you want to think of them as medial, what makes them medial is the fact that they're attaching to the medial side of the humerus. So muscles that live in the front attach to the medial side, they're more toward the middle of the body. Muscles that live on the back of the body, they're more toward the middle than the arm is. If you're lateral, you pull things away from the midline. If you're medial, you're found medial to the arm or the leg or the wrist, you're going to adduct. You're going to pull things back toward the middle. Yeah, so Jacqueline's asking about specific movements that would show this. I would presume that this is what a shoulder raise looks like. We could always go back to the jumping jack example. When you start to do that jumping jack and you raise your arms in the air, that's abduction. As you bring your arms back down, that's adduction. So a jumping jack, we abduct both the arm and the leg initially when you go to that outward position, and then we adduct them back together in the second part of a jumping jack. Only other movement that we have left is the flexion and extension of the whole arm. Flexion and extension, it's the same deals that it was when we talked about the hip joint. So if I'm a muscle that lives on the back side, if I attach to the back side of the humerus, here's my insertion, here's my origin. If I'm somebody that attaches somehow to the back side, so any of your muscles of the back side of the body, you're going to pull the humerus back. We're extending it away from the sternum, for example, away from the front side of the body. Extension is what the muscles that live on the back side of the body do. Flexion is what the muscles that live on the front side would do, pulling this arm back toward the front. Flexion. So just like it was down here with the femur, flexion, the guys who do flexion are the ones that live on the front. Just like it was when we were talking about down here with the wrist, the muscles that live on the front side do flexion. Generally in the body, muscles that live on the front side do flexion. Generally in the body, muscles that live on the back side do extension. Again, the one exception to that is what's going on here with the tibia. Since the knee joint is shaped oppositely to the rest of the body in terms of how it opens and closes, it's the opposite there. But everybody else, these rules apply. You live on the front, you do flexion. You live on the back, you do extension. Let's go, actually here. Let's go all the way back to this image right here. We are looking at, in this image right here, those muscles that we labeled or that we looked at the very beginning of class. When you are studying for the exam and you're studying muscle actions, here's why we need to know the locations of these muscles. Because if you know the locations of the muscles, you should be able to predict their action words. So check this out. I've got a group of muscles over here that are all on the front side of the thigh. These are all anterior thigh. When I talk about muscles that lived on the anterior thigh, all of these muscles, anterior thigh muscles, did they flex or extend the femur? Muscles that live on the anterior side, do they flex or extend the femur? Now, these are my flexors. Muscles that live on the anterior side, what do they do to the tibia? Do they flex or extend the tibia? Yeah, remember, this was the area where it got funky. So here's the opposite. So check this out. I've got my muscle man right here. All of these muscles live on the front side of the femur. I can make a prediction based on where they live that rectus femoris, spelled that wrong, would flex the femur. A function of rectus femoris, it would flex the femur. A function of rectus femoris, because it lives on the front side of the thigh, would be extending the tibia. I can make a prediction for my friends that live here on the back side. We've got our friend semitendinosis here. We've got biceps femoris here in the back side. I can make a prediction about these muscles, about what they do. When we're on the posterior side, it's opposite, right? So let's draw a circle and we'll write our rule here. Now that we're on the posterior, when I live on the posterior side of the thigh, what do I do to the femur? When I'm on the posterior side of the thigh. Yeah, now I'm extending the femur, right? Posterior side extends the femur, and we flex the tibia. So if I ask you about one of these muscles that lives here on the backside, you know, because it lives on the backside, and because all of my backside ones up here do flexion of the tibia and extension of the femur, I know that that would be correct. So I'm trying to save you going through and memorizing all of the specific functions of each of these muscles in here. Just memorize that my friends that live on this side of the body, they're going to flex the femur and extend the tibia, or excuse me, flex the tibia and extend the femur. All my friends that live right here on the body, flex the femur, extend the tibia. We can do the same thing then. We can go up to this part of the body. These ones are going to flex the forearm. These ones that live over here are going to extend the forearm. When we talk about muscles that live on, I'm going to have to clear my board. So, well, here, I can actually kind of do it up here. Muscles that are attaching on the outside of the humerus versus muscles that attach on the inside of the humerus. This is my lateral muscle doing abduction, my medial muscles doing adduction. Same thing out here. These muscles are lateral, so they're going to do abduction. These muscles are medial, so they're going to do adduction. So rather than memorizing the specific functions of muscles, number one, focus on memorizing their locations. If you know where everybody lives, you're in good shape. Number two, focus on those rules that we talked about. So anterior versus posterior, lateral versus medial. Memorize those rules. Consider the drawings that we did. So when we talked about the origin and the insertion, to help us with those rules. But if we know those rules and we know the muscle locations, the specific locations of each of those muscles, we're in really good shape. I will mention as we wrap up that there were some parts of the muscle actions in the packets that you just have to straight up memorize. I'm talking about things like the muscles here in the chest cavity, so the intercostals and the obliques, rectus abdominis. I'm talking about the muscles of the face, for example. Those were ones that you just have to straight up memorize. We can't predict those ones quite as well. So those ones, we need to take up the mental space to memorize their jobs. For all of these other ones, though, that we talked about during our class today, as much as possible, learn those rules, because then you can just predict it based on their locations. What questions do we have? This is all I was planning to cover with us. So what questions can I help us out with here at the end of our session? Ah, yes, I was just thinking actually as it got quiet that I needed to draw you all a penguin. So let's see if I can do a penguin disguised as a turkey. Let's see if I can make this happen. How are we feeling about actions now? Do you feel any better? A little bit better. Tierney says she's feeling much better. That's awesome. I feel like, and this may just be the fact that my mom is a kindergarten teacher, but I feel like turkeys always have like multicolored feathers, right? We pretend that they do. I feel like in real life they don't though. Maybe they do. I don't know. All right, there is our, oh, I'll try to give him a little gobbler too. Here's our penguin pretending to be a turkey, but he's also saying don't eat me. So we can't eat this penguin for Thanksgiving. All right, well, that is all I've got for today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off our recording. I'll stick around for a few minutes, but happy Thanksgiving to all of you. I hope you enjoy some good food, turkey, or we're ham people over here, so we're going to do ham. But have a safe Thanksgiving. Please be studying. I know it sucks to study over a break, but you're going to thank yourself for doing it when you don't have to cram everything. Impossibly try to cram everything right before you take that lab final exam. So good luck with your studying. Have a great holiday break. And as always, feel free to reach out via email if you have any questions.